The saddest goodbyes are the ones no one notices until the silence becomes louder than every word ever left unspoken. For 9 years, Evelyn Carter had loved the Alpha King without asking for anything in return. She never dreamed of a crown, never imagined herself standing beside the throne as Luna, and never wished for songs to be written about her devotion. Loving Adrian Blackwood had always been the quietest part of her life, hidden beneath ordinary mornings, long nights, and countless moments no one else remembered. On the evening that marked exactly 9 years since she first arrived at Blackwood Palace, the grand ballroom shimmered beneath thousands of crystal lights that reflected across polished marble floors like scattered stars. Noble families from every corner of the Northern Territories filled the room in elegant gowns and tailored suits, while musicians played soft melodies that drifted through the air like gentle waves. Laughter echoed beneath the towering ceilings, glasses clinked together in celebration, and every conversation revolved around the same subject. The kingdom had never been stronger. Harvests had flourished. Trade routes stretched farther than ever before. Neighboring pacts sought peace instead of rivalry. At the center of it all stood Adrian Blackwood, the Alpha King everyone admired. Tall, composed, and impossibly calm beneath the weight of his responsibilities, he greeted every guest with measured kindness. He listened carefully. He thanked every commander who had served the realm. He accepted every congratulation with quiet humility. From across the ballroom, Evelyn watched him the way she always had, standing just beyond the circle of attention where she had spent almost an entire decade. She knew exactly how he preferred his coffee before sunrise. She knew which old injury made his shoulder ache whenever rain approached. She knew he never remembered to eat lunch during council meetings unless someone gently placed a tray beside his papers. She knew the difference between the smile he offered diplomats and the smaller one that appeared only when children visited the palace gardens. She knew all of these things because she had been there every single day. Yet if someone had asked Adrian when he had first met Evelyn Carter, he probably would have paused before answering. The thought no longer hurt the way it once had. Some pains faded so slowly they eventually became part of a person's heartbeat. Evelyn adjusted the silver pin fastening her simple blue dress and quietly carried another stack of reports toward the royal study. She had spent most of the afternoon preparing tomorrow's council schedule before returning just in time to help organize the celebration. No one had asked her to stay late. She always stayed anyway. As she crossed the hallway overlooking the ballroom, 2 palace attendants smiled warmly. "Happy anniversary, Miss Carter," one whispered. Evelyn blinked in surprise. "You remembered?" The older woman laughed softly. "Of course. 9 years. You've practically become part of these walls." Evelyn returned the smile with genuine gratitude. "Thank you." They continued down the corridor while Evelyn remained standing alone beside the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. 9 years. Nearly 1/3 of her life had slipped quietly past these stone halls. She could still remember arriving with a single suitcase and a letter recommending her as a healer's assistant after the previous royal physician retired. She had been nervous, hopeful, and completely certain she would only remain a few months. Then she met Adrian. Not as a king surrounded by ceremony, but as a tired young ruler sitting beside an injured stable dog long after midnight, because he refused to let the frightened animal face surgery alone. He had thanked Evelyn for helping without asking her title, her family, or her rank. That simple kindness had changed everything. Love had never arrived like lightning. It had arrived one ordinary day at a time until she realized there was no corner of her heart untouched by it. She never confessed. There never seemed to be a right moment. Every year became another promise that perhaps next year life would slow down. Perhaps next spring. Perhaps after the next treaty. Perhaps after the next harvest. Time quietly transformed hope into habit. A burst of applause pulled Evelyn back toward the ballroom. Members of the Royal Council had gathered around Adrian, while Lord Harrison Whitmore raised a crystal glass. "Your Majesty," he announced proudly, "the kingdom celebrates another remarkable year under your leadership. We believe the time has finally come to prepare for the future in every possible way." More applause followed. Adrian offered a polite nod. Harrison smiled broadly before continuing. "With stability secured, the Council respectfully recommends that preparations begin for the Royal Luna Selection Festival next season." The room erupted into cheerful approval. Elegant ladies exchanged excited glances. Noble families whispered behind bright smiles. Mothers gently squeezed their daughters' hands. Evelyn remained perfectly still. She wasn't surprised. Everyone had expected this conversation eventually. The kingdom wanted an heir. The council wanted certainty. Tradition demanded a queen. Adrian looked across the crowd with the same calm expression he wore during every important discussion. For one long moment, Evelyn wondered if he might refuse. Instead, he lifted his glass with quiet grace. "If the council believes the time has come," he said evenly, "then we will begin the necessary preparations." Cheers echoed beneath the towering ceiling. Music swelled once more. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed with excitement. Evelyn heard every sound as though it came from the far side of a river. 9 years. Not once had she expected him to choose her. But somehow hearing those words spoken aloud gently closed the final door she had left open inside her heart. She smiled, not because she felt happy, but because she finally understood something she had spent nearly a decade refusing to accept. Waiting had become another way of standing still. She looked one last time toward Adrian Blackwood as he accepted another congratulation, completely unaware that the woman who had quietly stood beside his life for 9 years had already made the most important decision of her own. Before midnight, Evelyn Carter would leave the palace without saying goodbye, and by the time the Alpha King finally noticed she was gone, nothing inside either of their lives would ever feel the same again. The celebration continued long after the council reached its decision, but Evelyn Carter no longer heard the orchestra, the laughter, or the endless conversations drifting through the palace halls. She moved through the evening exactly as she always had, smiling politely whenever someone greeted her, answering every question with calm professionalism, and quietly making certain every guest had what they needed before disappearing into the background once more. No one noticed that something inside her had become perfectly still. It was not heartbreak anymore. Heartbreak belonged to the woman who had spent years hoping tomorrow might be different. What remained now was clarity. She climbed the familiar staircase leading toward the royal archives, carrying a stack of documents beneath one arm. Every step awakened another memory she had carefully tucked away over the years. There had been the winter Adrian caught a terrible fever after returning from a diplomatic journey through the mountains. For 3 nights, she had remained outside his chamber with the physicians, refusing to sleep until his temperature finally broke. When he recovered, he thanked every member of the medical staff personally. He had smiled at Evelyn and said, "You always make difficult days feel easier." She had treasured those words for months, even though he had never realized how deeply they settled into her heart. Then there had been the spring flood that destroyed dozens of homes along the eastern river. Adrian had spent weeks overseeing relief efforts, often returning after midnight completely exhausted. Evelyn had quietly left fresh meals in his office before anyone else arrived each morning. He rarely knew who prepared them. Once, he simply looked toward the empty hallway and said softly, "Someone here always remembers." She smiled at the memory because he had been right. Someone always remembered. It had simply never occurred to him that it was always the same person. Reaching her office, Evelyn placed the reports neatly upon the desk and opened the small wooden cabinet beside the window. Inside rested dozens of journals filled with schedules, medical notes, supply records, and careful observations collected throughout 9 years of service. She ran her fingertips across the worn leather covers before gently closing the cabinet again. Everything she had built inside these walls would continue without her. Someone else would organize meetings. Someone else would prepare emergency supplies before storms arrived. Someone else would remind the royal kitchen that the king preferred warm apple tea whenever long negotiations stretched into the evening. The palace had survived before Evelyn Carter arrived. It would survive after she left. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Carter," it was Margaret Ellis, the palace librarian, carrying a bundle of returned books. "I was looking everywhere for you. I nearly forgot these." Evelyn accepted the books with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Margaret." The older woman tilted her head. "Are you all right? You seem quieter than usual." Evelyn hesitated only a moment. "Have you ever realized something you should have understood years ago?" Margaret smiled knowingly. "More times than I care to admit." Evelyn laughed softly. "I think I finally have." Margaret squeezed her hand with unexpected tenderness. "Whatever it is, I hope it brings you peace." After she left, Evelyn stood beside the window, overlooking the moonlit gardens. Peace. That was exactly what she wanted. Not revenge. Not regret. Certainly not pity. She simply wanted to stop measuring her life by someone who had never asked her to wait. Adrian had never promised her forever. He had never encouraged dreams he could not return. The fault was never his. She had mistaken kindness for possibility because hope could be remarkably convincing when repeated long enough. Outside, fireworks blossomed above the palace towers, painting the night sky with soft bursts of silver and blue. Guests applauded from the terraces below. Evelyn watched the reflections shimmer across the fountain where she and Adrian had once shared coffee before sunrise while discussing repairs to the children's hospital. He had spoken for nearly an hour about improving education throughout the kingdom. She had barely touched her drink because she had been too busy memorizing the warmth in his voice whenever he spoke about helping others. It struck her now that her favorite memories had never been grand gestures. They had all been ordinary mornings, quiet conversations, and fleeting smiles. Somehow those simple moments had built a love strong enough to last 9 years and gentle enough to disappear without demanding anything in return. She crossed the room and opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside rested a small velvet box no larger than her hand. Carefully she lifted the lid. 9 tiny keepsakes rested inside, one for every year she had spent in the palace. A dried white flower from the first royal garden she helped restore, a brass key from the old infirmary, a faded ribbon from a charity festival, a silver button that had fallen from Adrian's winter coat during one particularly snowy morning. None of them held any real value. Yet together they told the quiet story of a life lived beside someone who had never known he was becoming another person's entire world. Evelyn closed the box slowly before placing it back inside the drawer. She would leave it there. It belonged to the palace now, just as those memories always would. Then she removed a single object from her jacket pocket. Her royal service pin caught the candlelight with a familiar glow. She stared at it for several long seconds before setting it gently in the center of her desk. No dramatic farewell letter accompanied it. No explanation waited beneath it. There was nothing left to explain. Sometimes the greatest kindness was leaving without asking someone to carry the weight of guilt they never intended to create. Beyond her office door, the celebration continued as though nothing in the kingdom had changed. Yet as midnight quietly approached, Evelyn Carter folded her simple traveling coat across one arm, took one last look at the life she had spent 9 years building, and silently reached for the door, carrying with her not the sorrow of losing the man she loved, but the quiet hope that somewhere beyond the palace walls she might finally remember who she had been before her heart learned to wait. The palace clock struck midnight, just as Evelyn Carter stepped into the quiet corridor leading toward the eastern gate. The distant music from the celebration faded behind thick stone walls until only the soft echo of her footsteps remained. For the first time in 9 years, she was walking through the palace without a schedule to complete, a report to deliver, or a patient waiting for her gentle hands. The silence felt unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting, as though the building itself had stopped asking anything of her. She carried only a small leather bag containing a few changes of clothes, several medical books she had purchased with her own savings, and the worn family photograph she had brought on her first day at Blackwood Palace. Everything else she left behind without hesitation. The office keys rested neatly inside her desk drawer. Her journals remained carefully organized inside the cabinet. Even the velvet box holding 9 years of precious memories stayed exactly where she had placed it. Some things belonged to the chapter that had finally reached its ending. As she reached the servants' entrance, the elderly gatekeeper looked up from his chair with surprised eyes. "Miss Carter? Leaving so late?" he asked kindly. Evelyn smiled with the same warmth she had offered him every winter when she secretly brought fresh bread to his post during snowstorms. "I am traveling for a while," she answered gently. "I wanted to leave before sunrise." The old man frowned with quiet concern. "Will you be back next week?" She paused for only a heartbeat before replying, "I do not think so." His expression softened. "Then I hope wherever you are going becomes a place that deserves someone like you." Evelyn felt unexpected emotion tighten her throat. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Please take care of yourself." He opened the heavy wooden gate without another question. Sometimes the kindest people understood when silence carried more truth than explanations ever could. Cool night air greeted her as she stepped beyond the palace walls. Above her, the stars stretched endlessly across the clear spring sky, while the towers of Blackwood Palace glowed behind her like distant memories already beginning to fade. She did not look back immediately. Instead, she breathed deeply, filling her lungs with crisp mountain air untouched by marble corridors or royal expectations. Freedom did not arrive with excitement. It arrived quietly, like the first calm morning after a long season of rain. Meanwhile, inside the grand ballroom, Adrian Blackwood continued greeting nobles who wished to discuss trade agreements, harvest celebrations, and preparations for the future Luna Selection Festival. Every conversation blended into the next. Advisors presented documents requiring signatures. Military commanders requested meetings later that week. Young nobles competed for a few moments of the king's attention. Adrian answered each request with his usual patience, never noticing that one familiar face no longer appeared near the edges of the room. More than once he instinctively reached for a folder he expected someone to hand him before realizing another attendant had already delivered it. He accepted the papers without a second thought. Habits built over years rarely disappeared in a single evening. Outside the palace, Evelyn followed the moonlit road leading toward the southern valley. The kingdom slept peacefully around her. Small cottages rested beneath ancient oak trees, their windows glowing softly with warm candlelight. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called across the hills while a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming wildflowers. She had traveled this road many times while delivering medicine to nearby villages, yet tonight every familiar landmark looked somehow different. She was no longer passing through on behalf of the palace. She was simply a woman walking toward a future she had not yet imagined. As dawn slowly approached, she reached a quiet hill overlooking Blackwood City. The rising sun painted the rooftops with gentle shades of gold, while morning mist drifted across the valley below. From this distance, the palace appeared almost small against the vast horizon. Evelyn finally turned to face it one last time. She remembered the frightened young woman who had arrived carrying a single suitcase and impossible hopes. She remembered every lesson, every friendship, every patient she had helped, and every ordinary morning that had quietly shaped the person she had become. She smiled, not because leaving was easy, but because she realized she no longer wished to be remembered only as someone who loved another person well. She wanted to discover who Evelyn Carter could become when she finally chose herself. She whispered a simple farewell that disappeared into the morning breeze before continuing down the road without looking back again. Several hours later, the palace slowly awakened to another ordinary day. Kitchen staff prepared breakfast. Guards changed shifts. Council members reviewed schedules. Margaret Ellis stopped outside Evelyn's office carrying two newly arrived medical texts, expecting to find her already organizing reports as she always did before sunrise. Instead, she found an empty room. The desk stood perfectly clean. Every document had been arranged with careful precision. Resting alone at the center of the polished wood was the silver Royal Service pin. Margaret's gentle smile slowly faded. She stepped inside, understanding immediately that this was no temporary journey. Quietly, she closed the office door and looked once more at the untouched room before sending a messenger to inform the palace administration that Miss Evelyn Carter had officially ended 9 years of faithful service. The message traveled through the halls with little urgency because everyone assumed she would eventually return. After all, people like Evelyn always came back. They always remembered everyone else before themselves. No one realized that this time she had not stepped away to rest. She had chosen an entirely different life, and while the palace continued following the same familiar rhythm, the empty space she left behind had already begun changing everything. Even though the one person whose life would be altered the most had not yet noticed she was gone. 3 weeks passed before anyone admitted that something inside Blackwood Palace no longer worked the way it always had. At first, the changes were so small they seemed almost meaningless. A council meeting started 15 minutes late because no one had prepared the revised agenda. The royal physician searched nearly an hour for medical records that had always appeared on his desk before sunrise. A shipment of winter blankets meant for a mountain village left 2 days behind schedule because no one remembered the route had changed after the spring floods. Each mistake seemed ordinary by itself, easily explained, quickly corrected. Yet together they formed a quiet pattern that no one could ignore forever. Adrian Blackwood noticed the delays but assumed they were growing pains caused by an unusually busy season. The Luna Selection Festival demanded endless planning. Neighboring packs continued requesting trade agreements, and summer harvest inspections filled nearly every afternoon. He worked longer hours without complaint, believing discipline could solve almost any problem. Even so, a strange feeling followed him through each day, as though something familiar had slipped just beyond reach. One cool morning, he entered the council chamber carrying a stack of reports. He placed them on the polished oak table before instinctively waiting for someone to organize them into the order he preferred. Several long seconds passed before he realized no one moved. A young assistant hurried forward, cheeks turning pink with embarrassment as she shuffled the papers into uneven piles. Adrian thanked her kindly and continued the meeting without mentioning it, but the discussion felt unusually disorganized. Important details appeared in the wrong order. Several appointments overlapped. 2 visiting ambassadors waited in separate reception rooms because each believed they had been invited at the same time. By late afternoon, Adrian rubbed his temples with quiet exhaustion. This had never happened before. Later that evening, he walked toward the Royal Library, hoping a few peaceful minutes with a history book might clear his thoughts. As he passed the hallway overlooking the Eastern Gardens, he slowed almost without realizing why. Fresh lilies filled the stone flower boxes beneath every window. Their gentle fragrance drifted through the open arches exactly as it did every spring. Adrian stopped beside one planter and frowned thoughtfully. "I thought someone preferred white lilies here," he murmured. The palace gardener looked up from trimming nearby branches. "Miss Carter always requested white lilies because you said their scent helped you think during difficult weeks, Your Majesty." Adrian looked at the flowers again. Bright yellow blooms swayed softly in the evening breeze. He searched his memory and suddenly realized the gardener was right. He had forgotten mentioning that years ago, after one particularly difficult treaty negotiation, someone else had chosen this season's flowers, never knowing the reason behind the old arrangement. "They are beautiful," Adrian said politely, though somehow the hallway no longer felt quite the same. Small moments continued following him everywhere. One afternoon, he reached for warm apple tea during a lengthy council debate only to discover someone had prepared black coffee instead. During a military inspection, he searched for the leather notebook containing emergency medical contacts and learned it had never been updated after several village clinics relocated. A visiting child asked whether the kind lady who always carried peppermint candies still worked at the palace. Adrian smiled gently and answered that he was not certain. The little boy nodded with quiet disappointment. "She always remembered my name," he said before running back to his mother. That evening, Adrian stood alone inside his office watching rain collect against the tall windows. He found himself staring at the empty chair near the fireplace, where someone often organized documents while quietly reading medical journals between meetings. He could almost picture the familiar rhythm of turning pages, the soft scratch of a fountain pen across paper, the peaceful presence that never interrupted his work, yet somehow made the room feel less lonely. He blinked, and the image disappeared. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Margaret Ellis entered carrying several books requested for the Royal Archives. She hesitated before setting them upon his desk. "Your Majesty, may I ask you something?" Adrian looked up. "Of course." Margaret folded her hands carefully. "Have you had time to replace Miss Carter's position?" Adrian's expression remained calm, though confusion briefly crossed his face. "Replace?" Margaret seemed surprised. "She resigned nearly 3 weeks ago." Silence settled across the office. Adrian stared at her as though he had misunderstood the words entirely. "Resigned?" he repeated slowly. Margaret nodded. "She left before sunrise after the anniversary celebration. Her office was emptied. Her service pin was returned. I assumed someone had informed you." Adrian searched his memory. Meetings, reports, festival preparations, endless conversations. Somehow no one had ever spoken to him directly. Or perhaps they had, and he had been too distracted to truly hear. "Where did she go?" he asked quietly. Margaret lowered her eyes. She did not say. After the librarian departed, Adrian remained motionless for several long minutes. Then, almost without thinking, he rose from his chair and walked through the silent corridors until he reached the familiar office at the end of the eastern wing. He pushed open the door. Everything stood exactly as Evelyn Carter had left it. The shelves remained perfectly arranged. The cabinets were spotless. The desk held nothing except a single silver service pin resting precisely at its center. Adrian stepped closer, his reflection shimmering faintly across the polished metal. An unfamiliar heaviness settled inside his chest. He looked around the quiet room, suddenly aware that he could not remember the last conversation he had shared with the woman who had quietly stood beside his life for 9 years. For the first time since she walked away, Adrian Blackwood whispered words he had never expected to ask. "Where is Evelyn?" Adrian Blackwood did not leave Evelyn Carter's office until the palace bells announced midnight once again. The room remained exactly as she had arranged it, every shelf carefully ordered, every drawer perfectly aligned, every document labeled in the neat handwriting he had seen thousands of times without ever truly noticing it. The quiet space carried no bitterness, no accusation, and no desperate farewell. Somehow that made the emptiness even heavier. He slowly opened the top drawer of her desk, expecting to find unfinished reports or forgotten notes. Instead, he discovered every assignment completed weeks in advance. Medical supply inventories stretched through the end of summer. Charity schedules had already been prepared for the coming season. Even emergency contact lists for every village healer across the kingdom had been updated with remarkable precision. It was as though Evelyn had quietly made certain the palace would never struggle because of her absence. Adrian closed the drawer with unusual care. She had left without creating a single inconvenience for anyone except the one she had loved most. The thought appeared so suddenly that he frowned at himself. Loved. Why had that word entered his mind? Before he could answer, another gentle knock interrupted the silence. Margaret Ellis stood outside the open door holding a small wooden box wrapped in faded blue cloth. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I found this while organizing the lower cabinet. I believe it belonged to Miss Carter." Adrian accepted the box with quiet gratitude. It felt surprisingly light in his hands. The wood had been polished so often that its edges had become smooth with time. There was no lock, only a simple ribbon tied neatly across the lid. He hesitated before loosening the knot. Inside rested 9 carefully arranged keepsakes. A pressed white flower lay beside a tiny brass key. A faded festival ribbon rested next to a silver button, a dried maple leaf, a cracked fountain pen cap, and several other ordinary objects that meant nothing at first glance. Beneath them rested small handwritten cards, each marked with a single year. Adrian lifted the first card. Year 1. Today the young king thanked me for helping the frightened stable dog. I have never met anyone who speaks to every living creature with the same kindness. I hope the kingdom always remembers this version of him. His fingers tightened around the paper. He remembered that dog. He remembered staying awake until sunrise beside the frightened animal. He had never known Evelyn had been there because she wanted to be, not because anyone ordered her. He reached for the second card. Year 2. He skipped lunch again. I left soup outside his office. He thanked the guard for reminding him to eat. I did not correct him. Seeing him smile was enough. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment. Every winter afternoon, every bowl of soup. He had always assumed different servants shared the responsibility. He had never wondered whether the same person quietly remembered every single time. One by one he continued reading. Year 3. He stayed late to write letters to families who lost loved ones during the storm. Everyone sees a powerful king. I wish they could see the man who refuses to let anyone grieve alone. Year 4. He laughed today after one of the children challenged him to a race across the garden. I think the kingdom is brightest whenever he forgets he is wearing a crown. Year 5. I almost told him how I feel. Then I saw how much the council needed him. Love should never become another burden for someone already carrying an entire kingdom. Adrian's breathing grew slower. Every card revealed another ordinary memory he barely remembered living. Yet Evelyn had treasured each one as though it were precious enough to preserve forever. None of the notes asked for anything. None blamed him. None wished he had chosen differently. They simply recorded quiet moments through the eyes of someone who had loved without expecting to be loved in return. His hands trembled slightly as he reached the final card. Year 9. Tonight the council asked him to begin choosing a Luna. He accepted because it is the right decision for the kingdom. I realized I have spent 9 beautiful years waiting for a future he never promised me. That is not his mistake. It is simply time for me to discover who I can become when my heart belongs to my own life again. If he is ever happy, then I hope happiness finds me too. Adrian stared at those final lines until the words blurred before his eyes. She had never expected him to apologize. She had never asked him to change. Even her goodbye had been filled with grace instead of resentment. He slowly looked back at the small keepsakes resting inside the box. A flower, a button, a ribbon, objects everyone else would have thrown away without another thought. Yet together they represented 9 years of silent devotion he had walked past every single day without seeing. He suddenly remembered dozens of forgotten moments all at once. The warm apple tea that always appeared before long meetings. The perfectly organized travel schedules. The gentle voice calming frightened children during medical visits. The quiet footsteps outside his office before sunrise. The reassuring presence that had become so constant he no longer recognized it as extraordinary. He had never noticed because Evelyn had never asked to be noticed. She had simply loved him the way sunlight fills a room, without demanding anyone look toward the window. Adrian carefully returned every keepsake to the box before tying the faded blue ribbon exactly as he had found it. He held the small wooden box against his chest for several silent moments while a truth he could no longer escape settled deep within his heart. The palace had not become emptier because an efficient member of the staff had resigned. It had become emptier because the quiet soul who had filled countless ordinary days with kindness had finally stopped waiting for someone who never realized she had been the brightest part of his life. Before sunrise the following morning, the royal council gathered inside the great conference chamber, expecting another routine session. Instead, they found Adrian Blackwood already standing beside the long window overlooking the eastern mountains, fully dressed for travel rather than government affairs. His black coat had been exchanged for a simple dark cloak without royal embroidery, and a weathered leather satchel rested beside his chair instead of the usual stack of official documents. The room fell into puzzled silence. Lord Harrison Whitmore finally cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, the delegates from the Western Territories will arrive before noon. The festival committee is also expecting your approval for the final guest list." Adrian listened patiently before answering with unusual calm. "Postpone every meeting that can wait 1 week. Delegate the remaining decisions to the council." Harrison stared in disbelief. 1 week? Adrian nodded. "The kingdom has capable people. It will continue functioning without me for a few days." Another advisor stepped forward carefully. "May we ask where your Majesty intends to travel?" Adrian glanced toward the rising sun beyond the palace walls. "I am going to find someone." No one spoke again. They had never seen the Alpha King postpone royal obligations for personal reasons. Throughout his reign, duty had always come first. Yet something inside his voice carried a quiet certainty that discouraged further questions. A short time later, Adrian mounted his dark horse beyond the palace gates with only one trusted companion accompanying him for the first stretch of the journey. He carried no royal banners and ordered the palace guards not to announce his movements to nearby towns. This was not a ceremonial tour. It was not a diplomatic mission. It was simply one man following the faint trail left by another who had quietly disappeared. The only clue they possessed came from Mr. Thomas, the elderly gatekeeper. He remembered Evelyn leaving through the eastern gate carrying a small leather bag before dawn 3 weeks earlier. She had mentioned traveling south, nothing more. Adrian thanked the old man personally before leaving. As the palace faded behind him, memories arrived with every mile. He remembered the first winter she worked at Blackwood Palace, though until recently he had not remembered her name from that season. He remembered seeing a young healer comforting frightened children during an outbreak of illness, while somehow smiling at every family she helped. He remembered receiving handwritten notes reminding him to rest after long council meetings. He had always assumed they came from whichever assistant happened to be assigned that week. Now he realized the handwriting had always belonged to the same person. The road wound through forests, rolling hills, and quiet farming communities beginning another ordinary summer morning. Adrian stopped at every village where travelers gathered, showing a small portrait of Evelyn painted years earlier for palace identification records. Most people shook their heads politely. Some believed they had seen a woman resembling her, but could not be certain. Every conversation ended with another direction and another possibility. By the third day of searching, Adrian reached the riverside town of Ashbrook. The local bakery had just opened when he stepped inside, hoping for fresh information. The elderly baker studied the portrait for several moments before smiling warmly. "Yes, I know her," she said. Adrian felt his heartbeat quicken. "You have seen Miss Carter?" The woman nodded. "A kind young healer stopped here about 2 weeks ago. She bought bread for herself and then quietly paid for breakfast for an older gentleman who had forgotten his wallet. She asked for directions to the Southern Valley before leaving." Adrian lowered his eyes for a moment. Even after walking away from everything she had known, Evelyn was still thinking about strangers before herself. He thanked the baker and continued south with renewed determination. Late that afternoon, while crossing a wooden bridge overlooking a peaceful stream, Adrian noticed children laughing near the riverbank as they chased brightly colored butterflies across a field of wildflowers. Their carefree joy reminded him of another memory hidden inside Evelyn's wooden box. Year 4. He laughed today after one of the children challenged him to a race across the garden. "I think the kingdom is brightest whenever he forgets he is wearing a crown." Adrian stopped his horse and looked toward the children for a long time. He could not remember the last time he had laughed without thinking about schedules, treaties, or responsibilities waiting for him afterward. Somewhere along the years, he had become so focused on leading the kingdom that he failed to notice the person quietly protecting the man beneath the crown. By sunset, he arrived at a small chapel where travelers often rested before continuing through the Southern Valley. The caretaker welcomed him with simple hospitality and listened carefully after seeing Evelyn's portrait. "She stayed here one evening," the elderly woman recalled. "She helped bandage a little girl's sprained ankle before dinner. The child cried when she left because she promised to keep traveling until she found a place where people needed her kindness." Adrian looked toward the fading light beyond the chapel doors. Those words lingered in his thoughts long after the conversation ended. Evelyn had not left because she stopped caring. She had left because she finally decided her kindness deserved a life larger than silent waiting. As darkness settled across the valley, Adrian stood beneath a sky filled with countless stars, holding the small wooden box close once more. Somewhere beyond the next mountain or the next quiet village, the woman who had loved him for 9 years was building a new life without expecting him to be part of it. For the first time since becoming Alpha King, Adrian Blackwood realized that this journey was not about bringing Evelyn back to the palace. It was about becoming the kind of man worthy of asking whether she would ever allow him to walk beside her again. On the 6th morning of his journey, Adrian Blackwood reached the Southern Valley just as the first rays of sunlight spilled across endless fields of wildflowers. Unlike the grand cities surrounding Blackwood Palace, this place moved at a slower rhythm. Farmers greeted one another by name. Children chased butterflies through open meadows. Shopkeepers left baskets of fresh fruit outside their doors with handwritten notes inviting neighbors to take what they needed. It was peaceful in a way the palace had not been for years. Adrian stopped beside the small general store and showed Evelyn's portrait to the elderly owner. The woman's face brightened immediately. "You are looking for Miss Carter," she said with a smile. Adrian felt hope rise inside him. "You know where she is?" The woman nodded toward the hills beyond the village. "She has been staying at the old Willow Creek cottage. It belonged to the retired physician who moved west last year. She spends every morning helping families before returning there at sunset." Adrian thanked her quietly and followed the narrow dirt road leading through tall maple trees. The closer he came, the more signs of Evelyn's presence appeared. Fresh herbs hung, drying beneath cottage porches. Small gardens flourished where neglected soil had once been empty. A young boy proudly carried a wooden crutch that had clearly been repaired with remarkable care. Everywhere Adrian looked, simple acts of kindness had quietly transformed ordinary lives. Near noon, he finally reached Willow Creek Cottage. It was smaller than he imagined, surrounded by lavender bushes and white fencing that needed fresh paint. A vegetable garden stretched across the backyard, while colorful flowers climbed the stone walls beneath open windows. Laughter drifted through the summer air. Adrian remained beneath a large oak tree overlooking the cottage, unwilling to interrupt the peaceful scene before him. Several children sat beneath the porch roof, while Evelyn knelt beside a little girl holding a storybook. She smiled as she read aloud, changing her voice for every character until the children burst into delighted laughter. Adrian had seen Evelyn smile many times inside the palace, but never like this. There was no careful restraint, no quiet professionalism, no effort to disappear into the background. She laughed freely, her eyes shining with genuine joy that seemed lighter than anything he remembered. When story time ended, an elderly farmer approached carrying a basket of tomatoes. "Miss Carter," he said warmly, "my wife insisted you take these." Evelyn laughed softly and shook her head. "You already brought vegetables yesterday." "Then she will simply bring more tomorrow," the man replied with a grin. "You have done more for this town in 3 weeks than anyone has done in years." Evelyn accepted the basket with grateful eyes. "Thank you. Please tell Mrs. Bennet I will stop by this afternoon to check her shoulder again." The farmer nodded before walking away, leaving Adrian standing motionless beneath the shade of the oak tree. She belonged here, not because the cottage was grand or the valley was famous, but because every smile surrounding her had been earned through quiet compassion instead of obligation. After the children ran home for lunch, Evelyn carried the empty storybooks inside. Adrian finally stepped onto the narrow stone path leading toward the front gate. The wooden latch clicked softly beneath his hand. Evelyn looked up at the sound. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. The summer breeze stirred loose strands of her chestnut hair while sunlight danced across the lavender flowers between them. Her expression shifted from surprise to disbelief before settling into calm recognition. "Your Majesty," she said gently. Adrian lowered his eyes with a faint, almost embarrassed smile. "I think Adrian is enough today." Silence lingered comfortably between them. It was not awkward, only unfamiliar. Evelyn studied him for a moment before opening the garden gate. "Would you like some tea?" He nodded quietly. They sat together on the small wooden porch overlooking the valley. The same distance separated them that had always existed inside the palace. Yet somehow it felt entirely different here. There were no royal guards waiting nearby, no council members carrying reports, only birds singing in nearby trees and the distant sound of children playing across open fields. Evelyn poured warm herbal tea into 2 simple cups before placing one in front of Adrian. "How did you find me?" she asked. "One kind person after another pointed me toward the next village," Adrian answered honestly. "It seems you have left pieces of yourself everywhere you have gone." She smiled softly. "People were kind to me. I simply tried to return that kindness." Adrian looked around the peaceful cottage. "They seem very happy that you are here." Evelyn followed his gaze toward the gardens where butterflies drifted lazily through the afternoon sun. "So am I." Her answer was quiet, but unmistakably sincere. Adrian felt those 3 words settle deeply inside his heart. During all the years she had served at Blackwood Palace, he could not remember hearing her speak about her own happiness. She had always asked whether everyone else was comfortable, healthy, prepared, or at peace. Only now did he realize how rarely anyone had asked the same questions about her. He looked back toward Evelyn, searching for the right words he had rehearsed throughout the long journey. Instead, he found himself saying the simplest truth he possessed. "I came because I finally noticed you were gone." Evelyn lowered her eyes into her teacup before lifting them again with remarkable gentleness. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, only quiet understanding. "Adrian," she said softly, "I stopped waiting for you 3 weeks ago, and for the first time in 9 years, I finally remembered how to begin living for myself." The afternoon sunlight slowly drifted across the wooden porch as neither Adrian nor Evelyn hurried to fill the silence. For years they had shared countless conversations inside palace corridors, yet this quiet moment somehow carried more honesty than all of those years combined. A gentle breeze carried the scent of lavender through the garden, while distant laughter from children echoed across the valley. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her teacup, allowing its warmth to settle into her palms. Adrian looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. It was not the composed confidence of a king addressing his people. It was the uncertain gaze of a man finally realizing how much he had failed to understand. "I read the notes," he said softly. Evelyn blinked once. "The wooden box?" He nodded. "Margaret found it after you left." A faint blush touched Evelyn's cheeks. "I never meant for anyone to read those. I am grateful that I did." His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet sincerity. "For the first time, I saw my own life through your eyes." Evelyn lowered her gaze. "They were only memories." They were much more than memories. Adrian reached into his travel satchel and carefully placed the small wooden box upon the table between them. The faded blue ribbon remained tied exactly as she had left it. I brought it because I thought it belonged with you. Evelyn stared at the familiar box without touching it. No, she whispered after a long pause. It belonged to the woman I used to be. She spent 9 years waiting for someone else to notice her. I think it should stay closed. Adrian slowly nodded. Then I will not ask you to open it. Another silence settled between them, but this one felt gentler. Neither of them needed to defend the past. It had already happened. Nothing either of them said could rewrite those years. Adrian looked across the small garden where butterflies drifted lazily among blooming flowers. The palace feels different without you, he admitted. Evelyn smiled faintly. People become accustomed to routines. That is what I believed at first. He shook his head slowly. Then I realized it was never about routines. It was about you. You quietly held together hundreds of small moments that no one else even noticed. Evelyn's smile remained warm but distant. The palace will learn new routines. Adrian looked at her carefully. And what about me? She met his eyes with surprising gentleness. You will learn them too. Those simple words carried no bitterness. Somehow that made them even harder to hear. Adrian realized she truly believed he would eventually move forward without her. She no longer expected anything from him. She no longer feared losing him because she had already accepted that loss long before leaving Blackwood Palace. He slowly stood from his chair and walked toward the white fence overlooking the valley. Children waved happily as they crossed the nearby footpath, and Adrian instinctively waved back. He watched them disappear over the hill before speaking again. Do you remember the stable dog? Evelyn laughed softly. Of course. I thought that night changed my understanding of leadership. He turned toward her. Now I think it changed something even greater, and I was the only person who never realized it. Evelyn joined him beside the fence. Adrian, you do not owe me your guilt. This is not guilt. He took a slow breath. It is regret. The honesty in his voice made Evelyn's expression soften. Adrian continued before fear convinced him to remain silent again. For years I believed I understood everyone around me. I remembered treaties signed 20 years ago. I knew every village map by heart. I could recite the names of every commander serving our borders. Yet I somehow failed to see the person standing beside me every single day. Evelyn looked toward the distant hills. You were carrying an entire kingdom. That is no excuse. He answered quietly. Because you were helping me carry it, and I never even asked whether the weight was hurting you. The breeze stirred the lavender once more. Adrian reached up and slowly removed the silver wolf crest fastened across his cloak. It was the royal emblem every Alpha King wore during official duties, the symbol of authority recognized throughout the Northern Territories. Without ceremony or dramatic gesture, he placed it gently upon the wooden fence beside them. Today I did not come here as your king, he said. I came as Adrian Blackwood. Evelyn looked at the crest resting quietly between them before lifting her eyes toward him. He did something she had never imagined seeing. Not because tradition required it. Not because witnesses expected it. Not because politics demanded it. He slowly lowered himself onto one knee before her, his eyes never leaving hers. There were no guards watching. No council members recording history. Only birds singing above the valley and the whisper of summer whined through the flowers. I cannot ask you to forget the years I never noticed what was already in front of me, Adrian said gently. I cannot ask you to return to the palace because I finally understand what I should have understood long ago. I cannot erase your loneliness. But I can promise this. If there is any road left for us to walk together, I will never again expect you to walk it alone. Evelyn's eyes shimmered with emotion, yet no tears fell. She had spent too many years hoping for this moment to mistake beautiful words for lasting change. After several quiet seconds, she offered Adrian a small, grateful smile. Please stand, she whispered kindly. You do not need to kneel for me. Adrian remained where he was for one more heartbeat before slowly rising to his feet. Evelyn gently picked up the silver wolf crest from the fence and placed it back into his hand. Do not leave your crown behind because of me, she said. If there is ever a future for us, it must begin with the man you are becoming, not with the guilt of the man you used to be. The next morning, Adrian Blackwood did not return to Blackwood Palace. Instead, he stayed in Willow Creek and quietly asked the townspeople where help was needed. No royal announcements followed him through the valley. No guards cleared roads before he arrived. He spent the day repairing broken fences beside local farmers, carrying supplies for the elderly, and listening far more than he spoke. At first, the villagers treated him with careful respect, uncertain how to behave around an alpha king dressed like an ordinary traveler. By the third day, they stopped seeing the crown and began seeing the man. Children invited him to join their games in the open field. An elderly carpenter taught him how to repair a weathered garden bench without using expensive palace tools. Mrs. Bennet insisted he accept a slice of homemade apple pie because, in her words, every hard-working guest deserved dessert before sunset. Adrian accepted every kindness with genuine gratitude. He slowly understood something Evelyn had learned long ago. A kingdom was not built only through laws, victories, or ceremonies. It was built through countless ordinary people quietly caring for one another every single day. Evelyn watched all of this without saying much. She never praised him simply because he had come looking for her, and she never criticized the years they had already lost. Instead, she observed whether his actions remained consistent after the emotions settled. Every morning, Adrian appeared ready to help before anyone asked. Every evening, he thanked every person who had shared even the smallest conversation with him. He no longer searched for ways to convince Evelyn to return. He simply tried to become someone worthy of standing beside her wherever she chose to live. Nearly a month after Adrian first arrived, the annual summer festival filled the valley with music, handmade decorations, and tables covered in fresh bread, wildflower honey, and colorful fruit harvested from nearby farms. Families gathered beneath strings of glowing lanterns while children danced across the village square. Evelyn stood near the old fountain laughing as several little girls placed tiny flower crowns upon one another's heads. Adrian watched her from across the square and realized something beautiful. She no longer smiled because she hoped someone would notice. She smiled because she was genuinely happy. That happiness had nothing to do with a palace or a title. It belonged entirely to her. As the evening sky slowly turned shades of pink and gold, Evelyn walked toward the quiet hill overlooking the festival lights. Adrian followed a few moments later, stopping beside her beneath the same wide sky that had witnessed both their separate journeys. "The council has written 3 times," Evelyn said with a gentle smile. Adrian laughed softly. "They have become very creative in reminding me that paperwork still exists." She looked at him with warm amusement. "Will you return?" He nodded. "Yes, the kingdom still needs its king." He hesitated before continuing. "But I will never rule it the same way again." Evelyn studied his face for a long moment. The hurried certainty she once admired had been replaced by quiet patience. The distance that had separated them for so many years no longer felt impossible to cross. Adrian did not ask her to leave the valley. He did not ask her to forgive the past. He simply stood beside her, allowing the silence to speak for itself. After several peaceful moments, Evelyn reached into the pocket of her light blue cardigan and removed a small pressed white flower. Adrian recognized it immediately. It matched the first keepsake from the wooden box. "I kept one thing," she admitted with a shy smile. "Not because I wanted to keep waiting, but because I wanted to remember that even beautiful memories can become the beginning of something healthier." She gently placed the flower into Adrian's hand before doing something she had never imagined she would do. She reached for his other hand first. Adrian looked down in quiet surprise as her fingers intertwined with his. She had spent 9 years following behind him. Now they stood side by side. There was no throne between them. No expectation. No silent sacrifice. Only 2 people choosing the same direction at the same moment. Adrian smiled with a warmth she had never seen before. Not the smile of an alpha king greeting his people, but the smile of a man who finally understood that love could never be earned through power alone. It had to be protected through attention, gratitude, and daily choice. As the first stars appeared above the valley, they slowly walked back toward the festival together, not because the story had returned to the beginning, but because it had finally found the future both of them were free to choose. If this story reminded you that true love is built by seeing, appreciating, and choosing each other every day, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share this video with someone who believes kindness should never go unnoticed, and tell us in the comments. Do you think Adrian deserved a second chance, or did Evelyn make the bravest choice by walking away first?